Reading at some length from the article The Myth of Reliability of DSM by Stuart A. Kirk and Herb Cutchins, I highlighted how the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, managed to move the conversation surrounding psychiatry from the validity of diagnosis to the reliability of diagnosis through the work of Robert Spitzer at a time in which criticism of the mental health industry was at an all-time high. In turn, the APA presented the DSM-IV, the development of which was headed by Robert Spitzer, as the solution to this same problem of reliability. And many other key figures fell in line, in many cases praising the new edition as having solved the problem of reliability entirely. Examining what little evidence was provided for these claims, however, Kirk and Cutchins outline how the DSM-III did little to improve on these issues. Nevertheless, to move forward, it is also important to examine the conversation points offered by the DSM-IV Task Force. The development of DSM-IV, published in 1989 by Alan J. Francis, M.D., Thomas A. Whittaker, Ph.D., Harold Allen Pincus, M.D. Here it is important to take note of Alan Francis, who had been appointed chair of the DSM-IV Task Force in 1987. He also worked for Robert Spitzer on the DSM-III. As the authors write, the APA Committee on Psychiatric Diagnosis and Assessment met in September 1987 to explore possible timetables for the publication of DSM-IV, including whether to proceed at all, and, if so, when this should begin. It is of interest that the concerns raised by Zimmerman were considered by the Committee on Psychiatric Diagnosis and Assessment at that time. Here, the reference to criticisms by Zimmerman are from the article Why Are We Rushing to Publish DSM-IV by Mark Zimmerman. 4 arguments were raised against proceeding with DSM-IV. 1. A revision might disrupt researchers, confuse clinicians, and contribute to an impression that psychiatric diagnosis is whimsical. 2. A revision might create unnecessary controversies regarding particular diagnoses. 3. Attention devoted to the specifics of definitions and criteria sets might result in excessive and trivial changes. 4. The DSM-III and DSM-III Revised had already represented major changes, and there might not be a substantial need to tinker with them. The Committee on Psychiatric Diagnosis and Assessment concluded that the most compelling reason for beginning work on DSM-IV was the scheduled publication of the 10th edition of the World Health Organization's Internal Classification of Diseases, ICD-10, in 1993. The United States is under a treaty obligation with the World Health Organization to maintain a coding and terminological consistency with the ICD. The APA could not simply ignore the ICD-10 and continue to proceed with DSM-III Revised in its current form. Adjustments and adaptation in DSM-III Revised would have been necessary with the publication of ICD-10, even if work on DSM-IV were not begun. The Committee on Psychiatric Diagnosis and Assessment decided that the most efficient and least disruptive decision for clinical practice and research was to revise the American and World Health Organization diagnostic manuals concurrently and congruently, as has previously been the case with both DSM-II and DSM-III. For future reference, this would not be the case for the DSM-IV and the publication of the ICD-11. We agree with Zimmerman that the empowering of a task force charged with the responsibility of developing DSM-IV might run the risk of allowing whimsical and arbitrary shifts in the nomenclature. Indeed, it is a temptation for a task force or a work group member to argue for the inclusion of changes that express his or her theoretical or empirical perspective. We have noticed many such instances in the past and present effort. Revisions made in this way are less reflective of the totality of the research evidence in the field than of the forces determining membership and influence on a particular committee. Skepticism regarding the scientific and consensual bases for any changes or lack of changes is readily generated in the absence of documentation. And pay special attention here. Zimmerman's concerns regarding the scientific basis of DSM-III revised are understandable given the lack of explicit documentation for the decisions made in DSM-III and DSM-III revised. It must be recognized that DSM-III and DSM-III revised were, by necessity, the result of expert group consensus subject to the limitations of group process. Although the recommendations of the members of the DSM advisory groups were based on their knowledge and understanding of the research literature, the lack of any systematic review of this literature before decisions were made and the lack of documentation of the empirical and/or conceptual bases for the revisions sometimes led to at least the appearance of arbitrariness. Concerning expert group consensus, Alan Francis, addressing issues with the publication of the DSM-V in his book Saving Normal, An Insider's Revolt Against Out-of-Control Psychiatric Diagnosis, DSM-V, Big Pharma, and the Medicalization of Ordinary Life, from 2013, describes the process of expert group consensus while working on the DSM-III in more explicit detail. But first, Francis qualifies, repeating the same lines about reliability and the solidification of the profession through the publication of the DSM-III. Diagnosis, or the reliability of diagnosis, if you will, was exposed as the Achilles heel that might bring psychiatry down. Without Robert Spitzer, whom Francis later refers to as Bob, psychiatry might have become increasingly irrelevant, drifting back to its pre-war obscurity, or rather, pre-World War II obscurity. The development of DSM-III faced one great handicap. There was very limited scientific evidence then available to guide any of its decisions. That is, which disorders should be included in the manual and which symptoms should be chosen to describe each disorder. Bob filled the huge gaps by bringing together small groups of experts on each disorder and picking their brains to thrash out how best to define the criteria sets. The process wasn't pretty to watch. It had the feel more of virtuoso performance art than scientific deliberation. The meetings all followed a remarkably uniform pattern. A group of about 8 or 10 experts would be virtually locked down in a room and were not to emerge until they could come to an agreement. The mornings were loud and unruly, with experts shouting out what they thought were the best symptoms, often disagreeing vociferously with one another. Their passionate views were argued with the fierce determination that comes from lived experience rather than scientific data, and there seemed to be no rational way of choosing among their different suggestions. Bob would be mostly quiet, typing fast and furiously in a corner, trying to get it all down. After a few anarchic hours, a big tray of terrific deli food would arrive. The experts would finally quiet down as they instead worked over the sandwiches, slaw, pickles, and cream soda. Bob would keep trying furiously, totally focused and seemingly oblivious to the food or his surroundings. Miraculously, by lunch's end, Bob would have digested the morning's chaos into a draft criteria set that neatly condensed into one coherent definition all the divergent suggestions. The afternoon would usually be much calmer, the drowsy experts fine-tuning Bob's compromise product. Whenever controversy did persist, the advantage went to whoever was most loud, confident, stubborn, senior, or spoke to Bob last. This is a terrible way to develop a diagnostic system, which would be subject to all sorts of biases, but it was the best way available at the time. And the surprise is that it worked as well as it did. The product was surely flawed, but also remarkably useful. While Francis tries to qualify his criticism beforehand, this nevertheless reads like the following. They did their best. It does not exactly exude confidence in the DSM as a scientific solution to psychiatry's very relevance, as Francis tries to emphasize here, or as Robert Spitzer has tried himself to emphasize. The DSM standardization of psychiatric diagnosis by using explicit rules for making a diagnosis has been critical to the explosion of research and knowledge in the mental health field. And this is from the Foreword to The Loss of Sadness by Horowitz and Wakefield. As Francis and the other authors of the development of DSM-IV continue, then still in the development stages of the 4th edition, we now have an opportunity in DSM-IV to provide the first well-documented psychiatric nosology. This will be informed by the research that was stimulated by the provision in DSM-III of specific and explicit diagnostic criteria. We have built into the DSM-IV process a number of safeguards to minimize the occurrence of arbitrary and whimsical revision. And do notice the constant reference here to whimsical revision. 2 conferences have already been held to discuss the methodological issues that require consideration in the construction of DSM-IV. These conferences were attended by representatives of the task force and expert consultants on the design, analysis, and review of empirical research. The first Methods Conference was held in August 1988 to discuss issues and procedures for aggregating and analyzing data from different studies to maximize a comprehensive and objective consideration of the empirical literature. The second Methods and Applications Conference was held in November 1988 to discuss the criteria for change in DSM-IV, the procedures to be used in reviewing research, selecting the validators for items and criteria sets, revising criteria sets, conducting field trials, and the methodology for resolving the various issues identified by the work groups. It was apparent from the Methods and Applications Conference that any set of criteria to guide changes in DSM-IV would necessarily be fallible and variable across disorders. Nonetheless, a few principles were emphasized. Nothing in DSM-III revised is sacred, but revisions should not be based simply on expert opinion. Decisions should be substantiated by explicit statements of rationale and explicit, systematic review of the evidentiary basis. Consideration should be given to clinical utility, user-friendliness, and the impact on other diagnoses or criteria within the DSM. It is very important to achieve greater compatibility with ICD-10, but this should not be at the cost of sacrificing important clinical concepts or distinctions. It is recognized that revisions can be disruptive to research programs, and that some revisions are more disruptive than others. The intent will be to find the optimal balance among historical tradition as embodied in DSM-III and DSM-III Revised, compatibility with ICD-10, evidence from the current reviews of the literature, and analysis of unpublished datasets, and widely established expert consensus. The requirements for evidence to support change in DSM-IV will be set much higher than was demanded in DSM-III and DSM-III Revised. But the evidentiary requirements will also vary across disorders since the quantity and quality of data available to DSM-III and DSM-III Revised were themselves not consistent across disorders. The authors here acknowledge full well that the development of the DSM-III and its diagnostic criteria were developed far more in relation to expertise, essentially by committee, than any scientific process. Francis has since, as highlighted in his book, Saving Normal, shown just how messy of a process this truly was. Whenever controversy did persist, the advantage went to whoever was most loud, confident, stubborn, senior, or spoke to Bob, Robert Spitzer, last. As it was ongoing, the DSM development process was presented as something scientific. Only well after publication, as we see here, was the reality of its development made clear. The authors acknowledge this here on the one hand, but seem to brush past it, insisting, as it were, that their edition will be more scientific by putting a higher burden of proof on making changes to the earlier version. And notice here, the requirements for evidence to support change in DSM-IV will be set much higher than was demanded in DSM-III and DSM-III Revised. The DSM-III was not a simple revision of DSM-II. It was a total overhaul. To refer to it as a revision in this context is highly inadequate. And the issue is, you do not take something that lacks a scientific basis and place the burden of scientific proof on making any potential changes after the fact. Nothing in DSM-III revised is sacred, but revisions should not be based, as was the case for the DSM-III, simply on expert opinion. As Kirk and Cutchins wrote in their article, The Myth of the Reliability of DSM, just prior to the publication of the DSM-IV, mind you, the scientific integrity of the revision process cannot be assessed until long after a revised DSM is published. By then, the next revision is underway, and criticism of the last revision appears petty or irrelevant or both. But unless past claims by proponents of DSM are scrutinized in light of the scientific evidence that was used at the time, we are unable to evaluate the extent to which science and systematic evidence support the process of continual revision. Also note, the primary justification for developing another version of the DSM was based on the need for consistency with the forthcoming 10th edition of the World Health Organization's Internal Classification of Diseases, or ICD-10. But as the authors make it clear, they will be hesitant, or they were hesitant, to make any changes in this regard as well. And with the issues surrounding the DSM-III and the DSM-IV as outlined thus far, it is also important to realize, in addition to being used for the diagnosis of clients or patients, the DSM, its classifications and parameters, have consistently been used as the basis for research in the various mental health fields, and this research in turn is used to justify treatments for clients or patients who have been labeled with a DSM diagnosis. Take CBT as I have previously covered. Despite researchers' efforts, the broad meta-analytic reviews of CBT, as highlighted in articles like The Efficacy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, a review of meta-analyses, or Why Cognitive Behavioral Therapy is the Current Gold Standard of Psychotherapy, reveal problematic research already with a significant lack of studies using no treatment or placebo controls, among other issues. How much more problematic is this type of research, considering how definitions, measurements, and other defining features of a study are reliant on the DSM and its descriptions of conditions? But next time, I will continue with Alan Francis and his writings addressing the development of the DSM-V. I hope to see you there.